An Affliction of the Heart, Volume 2, by Anonymous Pegasus. Chapter 13, Resolution. How'd you know where I'd be? Warren asked quietly, his head on his hooves, staring at Swarm's grave. Kuno raised a brow, looking at him sideways, her expression quizzical. Warren gave a soft laugh, burying his nose against his hooves. I guess that is kind of a stupid question.
We always seem to have our big emotional moments right here in front of your ex-wife,
Kuno said with a faint wry smile. Warren nodded gently, rubbing a nose with a hoof. How hard was it for you to keep it a secret for so long? Kuno's ears played back.
I wish I could say it was easy, but it was so hard.
She shook her head slowly, rubbing at her cheek with her hoof, frowning deeply.
Especially when you kept telling me how in love with me you were, and how your greatest fear was waking up one day and not being in love with me anymore.
Warren nodded gently, looking up at her. So it was pretty hard, huh? Kuno nodded gently.
Indeed. The guilt was tearing at my insides, but I resolved to make you happy. I didn't think that we could survive you finding out that it had been a spell all along. And I was terrified of losing you. I know I'm probably a monster, but between having you know the truth and losing you, or being blissfully unaware and happy with me, I'd take you being happy with me every time.
Warren nodded again, rising to his hooves shakily, and wrapping his forehooves around the changeling, kissing her neck gently. I understand. It must have been really bad.
How are you so understanding?
Kuno asked, pinning her ears back and sniffling faintly, kissing the bridge of his nose. I put myself in your place, Warren said simply.
Explain.
Kuno said confused. Well, you had this weak stallion show you sympathy. You used this spell on him, you started to siphon love from him, and then you started to fall in love with him. You left because you couldn't handle the guilt, but you decided he'd be happiest if you were there to keep him happy. And that kept you happy. But the more time you spent with him, the more attached he grew to you. You did everything for him. You were in love with him. You turned into a dragon for him. But always, there was this terrible secret hanging over. That was all just a spell. A facade. He wasn't really in love with you, Warren trailed off, scratching a hoof against his cheek delicately. You kept it a secret because you care about me, and because you love me. Kuno sniffed faintly, tears spilling down her cheeks.
I don't deserve you,
she whispered softly, looking away. Warren shook his head, pulling the changeling's head around so he could lay a gentle kiss around her lips. Life isn't fair. Take the good things and hold them with both hoofs. I know I'm not going to let you go, no matter what. Warren pressed close to the changeling, holding around her tightly with his hooves. Even if you're not perfect, even if you're a monster, you're my monster. You're my... Warren licked his lips nervously, before finishing quietly. You're my sunshine. Kuno's ears splayed back, and she melted a little on the inside, squeezing Warren tightly with her hooves, sniffing faintly, and nuzzling into his neck.
I love you, Warden. I love you so much.
I know, Warren said with a gentle smile. Warren and Kuno arrived back at their home nearly an hour after they started walking. Warren had injured his hoof repeatedly when he struck her, and he needed support to even get back home, limping heavily, leaning on the changeling. Kuno, for her part, was already beginning to heal. The trauma Warren had imparted on her face in his rage was already fading, and Kuno was returning to her usual cute self. Warren stumbled and splayed out right in the middle of the hallway once he got inside the front door, resting his head on his good hoof and closing his eyes. Kuno picked her way around him, rolling her eyes slightly. She headed to the kitchen, digging out a slice of wedding cake and stuffing her muzzle with it, before heading back towards the front door. Where are you going? Warren asked warily. Kuno raised a brow down at him.
You heard my entire conversation with Chrysalis, right?
Warren nodded meekly.
Then you know that she is in possession of a magic spell that can allow her access to a pony's heart through subtle manipulation. And she's hell-bent on getting at shining armor.
Kuno pointed out calmly, opening the front door. Warden groaned faintly, pushing himself to his hooves. Kuno passed at the front door, looking back over her shoulder with a frown.
You don't have to come with me. I'm just going to warn Cadence and Shining Armor of what's going to happen.
Warden shook his head, stumbling over to the painting in the hallway and pushing it aside, reaching down into the wall to pull out the packet of powdered green swath. He opened it up, frowning slightly. You're going to be potentially facing a changeling queen, and I doubt you'll be able to turn into a dragon this time around. Not to mention that you have to convince Shining Armor that there's a subtle spell that his wife can't detect. They'd instantly be suspicious of you for so many reasons. It'll just be easier with me there. Kuno paused at that, and then gave a gentle nod.
You're right.
Warren gave a faint smile and then pressed the packet against his nose, inhaling hard. He paused as he drew back, scrunching up his face and then sneezing repeatedly. A shiver passed down his form, and then he bounced slightly in place, nodding once. I'm ready. Let's go. Kuno gave him an uncertain look, ears pinning back.
I'm not letting you fly there.
There isn't exactly a train outside, Warren said flatly. Kuno nodded once, pushing the door open and stepping outside. Her form shivered, and with a flash of green, the shape of a griffin resolved itself, nearly twice as large as Warden. Warden stared. I didn't realize griffins were so huge. They're not, Kuno said, clicking her new beak impatiently. Climb on. Warden delicately stepped over to his now griffin wife, climbing carefully up onto her back. Hold on around my chest and not my neck, and don't pull out any feathers, Kuno stated flatly, clicking her wicked-looking beak for punctuation. Warden nodded, wrapping his hooves around her. Kuno extended her new, massive wingspan and then leapt into the air, darting off towards Canterlot. Nearly half an hour later, Kuno landed at the outskirts of Canterlot, and Warren stumbled off her back, staggering slightly and then slowly stretching. Kuno shuddered and reverted back to her default non-changeling form, the white Pegasus with blue mane and tail. So, what's our plan? Warren asked, rubbing his forehead and stretching slowly. Kuno hummed thoughtfully. Well, it's not morning yet. Night Court is probably still in session. Hopefully Shining Armor is on call. I know they keep a few guards on hoof during the court. Warren raised a brow at her slowly. How do you know all this? Kuno gave a faint giggle at that, shaking her head. We took over Canterlot once, remember? Ah, right, Warren said, scratching his head with a hoof. So, Kuno said, shifting her weight from side to side awkwardly. We're cool, right? Warren raised a brow. You need to ask? Kuno nodded, nudging him and beginning to walk into the sleepy Canterlot. Warren sighed faintly. I love you, Kuno. You're a changeling. Surely you can feel it. But it was so sudden. You went from hating me to loving me in a few hours. I feel like maybe the spell came back or something, Kuno admitted, ears flattening as she looked away. Warren shook his head, giving a faint smile, stopping and then pulling Kuno around to face him, a hoof on her chin. He leaned in to kiss her nose gently. I love you, Kuno, and it isn't magic this time. And even if it is somehow magic, then that's fine. The point is, you've done enough for me so far for me to fall in love for you anyway. It just took me a few hours to get over the urge to beat you senseless. Kuno smiled, kissing his nose and then continuing to walk towards the castle. Thank you for being so awesome, Warden. Hey, it's not like I had that many choices, Warden teased, wiggling a hoof at her. And I'm married to you. Kinda stuck. Mine forever, Kuno purred, pressing close to him as they walked, kissing his neck happily. Focus, Kuno, Warren said with a faint smile. We have a prince to save. The two dark guards at the front gates of the royal palace reluctantly moved aside to allow the two Pegasi into the court when Warden announced to them that he had an urgent message for Shining Armor on behalf of the reserve guard. Technically, Warden hadn't been a member of the reserve guard since the court hearings where he had defended his actions on keeping company with a changeling. He had been temporarily withdrawn from the reserve guard program, pending the court's decision, and had simply never gone back. Kuno and Warden walked through the front gates, and then immediately headed for the night court building. Another pair of guards stood aside to allow them into the building itself, and Warden and Kuno stepped inside the doors. Princess Cadence and Princess Luna were both sitting on a throne each, being addressed by a farmer who had a complaint about a swarm of parasprites ripping down his barn, which he needed to house his cattle feed for the coming season. Kuno paused and sat down outside of the court, and Warren sat next to her, blinking once. No rush? Kuno shook her head gently.
No rush. It's a subtle spell that I gave her, and it takes a long time for it to work. And it requires a certain amount of non-magical work. It'd take quite a long time for her to actually get anywhere, which begs the question of how exactly she intends to get that close to Shining Armor with any kind of regularity.
Warren hummed thoughtfully, rubbing a hoof against his chin and then scrunching up his nose.
Wonder weed messing with your senses?
Kuno asked with a faint smile. Warren nodded, poking out his tongue in distaste.
I can't taste anything and my fur feels like a thick
Glove. Kuno giggled before she stiffened, whirling to face the door. There was a reverberating sound of magic, and then the doors were pushed open by Queen Chrysalis herself. The slumped forms of two struggling guards were visible just outside the doors, both of them trying to force themselves up from a green magical glow holding them firm to the ground. Warren's eyes widened and Kuno leapt to her feet. They were all beat to the punch by Princess Luna, who threw herself from her throne towards the changeling queen, squaring her stance. A flash of blue engulfed the princess's form, and suddenly she was encased in stylish silver armor from nose to hooves.
Release my guards immediately,
Princess Luna demanded, a hoof lifting imperiously. Chrysalis gave a snort of contempt, and her horn magic faded. The guards immediately rose, scooping up their spears and moving to stand on either side of the queen, pointing their spears inwards. Kuno's eyes narrowed before they widened slightly, and she murmured,
"Oh, you sneaky bitch."
Warren opened his mouth to ask for an explanation when Chrysalis gave a shrug of her shoulders.
I am here to turn myself in. My hive has exiled me. I wish to impart information on their destruction to you.
Luna stiffened slightly, staring at the changeling queen from under her helm, her eyes narrowing suspiciously.
This seems like a bad plan,
Warden stated with a frown. Kuno turned towards him slightly, hissing in an explanation.
Guess who's going to be interrogating her?
As though to confirm Kuno's suspicions, Chrysalis tossed her mane, eyes narrowing dangerously.
I will only divulge this information to your highest guard. He should remember me quite well.
Princess Luna looked back over her shoulder at Princess Cadence. The Princess of Love was looking mutinous, standing on splayed legs, breathing hard with suppressed rage.
Throw her in the dungeon. We can deal with her later.
Princess Luna turned back to face the queen and nodded once.
To the dungeon!
Chrysalis gave a contemptuous snort, sneering faintly at the two princesses. The two guards pressed closer, their spears almost touching her sides.
Very well.
Chrysalis spat, allowing herself to be crowded towards the dungeon. Kuno frowned, biting her bottom lip.
Why didn't you stop them?
Warren asked, his ears pinning back. Kuno looked back at him, frowning deeply.
A changeling trying to interrupt a queen from being locked up in the dungeon?
Warren paused at that, and then nodded quietly.
What do we do? I don't think Chrysalis even noticed me. So, we get the three princesses in shining armor in a room together, and we lay it all out. Everything. We just have to hope they believe us,
Kuno said uncertainly. We could go home, Warren offered quietly. Kuno frowned deeply.
What?
We could just go home, Warren reiterated, looking away. Shining armor exasperated my injuries when he kept me from you. I owe him no allegiance. Shaking her head, Kuno gently nudged him. You know that if we had just walked away, you'd never forgive yourself. Warren sighed softly. I know. Kuno smiled, nudging his cheek with her nose. Good. Now get me an audience with Celestia and the rest of them, pet. Warren rolled his eyes, kissing Kuno on the cheek. You know you're only supposed to call me that when I'm wearing the collar and the leash. Kuno giggled, nuzzling him gently and wrapping a hoof around him to stop him from leaving. I love that we haven't changed, despite everything. Warren smiled, disentangling himself from his wife. I know, hon. I know, he murmured, kissing her cheek. But we can discuss this later when we're not trying to save people. Kuno pursed her lips and then nodded, pouting. Emergencies always get in the way of my naughties. Warren smiled, pushing away from her and heading for Cadence. Kuno looked very small as she sat in front of Celestia, Luna, Cadence, Shining Armor, and 6 of the Royal Guard. Kuno was in her true form, her wings twitching nervously. Warren was sitting a little bit behind her, looking out of place.
Chrysalis came to my home and demanded a spell from me. It was a legacy of my old hive. It's a potent love spell that takes effect over a very long time. It's very subtle, and you need to know what you're looking for.
And how do we know you haven't used the spell on Warden? Celestia asked bluntly. Kuno stammered at that, unsure. Warden stepped forward. Allow me, he said gently, touching Kuno's shoulder with a hoof. Kuno nodded, lowering her head. Warden lifted his head. Kuno had me under the spell for nearly 2 years. I have no idea. I thought that all of my feelings were mutual. And this is no longer the case? Luna asked, raising a brow. Warden nodded once. She lifted the spell recently. A few hours ago, in fact.
And yet you stand with her now?
Cadence asked, her eyes narrowing. Warren paused, looking back at his wife. She lifted the spell and I wasn't in love with her anymore. I assaulted her physically, several times. But once I had time to think it over, I fell in love with her again. Or for the first time, however you want to look at it. You realize now that we cannot accept your witness, Warden. Shining Armor stated flatly. You've been alone with some pony who has, through your own admission and hers, access to magic that muddles your mind. Warden nodded gently at that. Do whatever you need to confirm this, but we have this information, and we couldn't just sit on it. Even after what I did to you in the courtyard 2 years ago? Shining Armor asked calmly. Warren gave a slow exhale, chewing on his tongue. I was all for going back to our nice bed, considering this is the second time in 24 hours I've needed to dose myself up with green swath powder just to get around.
So, in the last 24 hours, you have been married, fell out of love with, and then fell back in love with a changeling whom has had you under a magic spell for 2 years, subtly manipulating your emotions, only for Queen Chrysalis to come and steal the spell from your changeling wife, which is presumably what set into effect the chain of events that led you to finding out about it?
Cadence asked with a raised brow. Warden gave a single nod. In short, Cadence shook her head slowly while Luna and Celestia leaned close to each other to exchange a short burst of whispered conversation. So, how do you propose we deal with the situation? Shining Armor asked. We can't confirm your story, and if the magic does as you say it does, it would be a dangerous, insidious thing to combat. Kuno lifted her head, taking a step forward.
I have an idea how to deal with this.
Warren laid down, resting his head on his hooves. He passed out almost instantly. Warren and Pegasus Kuno were led by an inconspicuous royal guard entourage to a covered carriage. Warren climbed up into it, rubbing his head and sitting down on the seat, while Kuno sat on the other side. The guard closed the door, and the carriage jolted as it started down the long path towards Ponyville. What'd I miss? Warren asked, rubbing his forehead.
Well, Chrysalis is boned. And not in the good, happy way.
Kuno said with a soft giggle. How so? Warren asked, sniffling faintly and rubbing his eyes.
Well, I used my spell on Shining Armor under close observation of all three princesses. Cadence was the first to figure out how to sniff it out, and Luna was the first to be able to lift it. I don't think that Chrysalis knows I was there, and even if she did sense me, she's in the dungeon now,
Kuno said with a smug smile.
and the spell is now rendered completely useless. They'll just lift it every time she uses it.
You're not going to do anything more than that? Warren asked blankly. Kuno raised a brow at him, a sly grin stretching her muzzle.
Not when she's telling them changeling secrets of her own free will.
Why would she do that? Warren asked uncertainly.
Because,
Kuno began, waving a hoof.
that's her endgame plan. I'm not sure on the details, but the gist of it is that she'll be in the dungeon, waiting. Shining Armor will be the one to tend to her, and she'll use her magic to slowly make him fall in love with her. Eventually she'd be able to engineer her escape and get away, taking him with her. And she'd get him always in there with her thorough promises of information.
So, they're manipulating her while she thinks that she's manipulating them? Warren asked blankly.
Yep.
Kuno said with a grin.
Or they could just not have Shining Armor be her keeper.
Warren sat back at that, frowning deeply and saying with heavy sarcasm, Geez, trying to get her jailer to fall in love with her. Who even does that?
Some pony who's desperate and knows when she's onto a good thing.
Kuno said with a soft smile. Warren grinned at that, taking one of her hooves in his own and tugging her over to his side of the carriage, leaning in to kiss her neck and cheeks slowly. So, no big fight and climactic moment?
The world doesn't work like that,
Kuno chided, poking his nose with a hoof. Warren cast his gaze at the door, and then tugged the curtain across the window to give them more privacy. I bet we could get a climactic moment right here if we wanted. Kuno gave a naughty giggle at that, looking up at her husband and then nuzzling into his cheek affectionately.
You don't want to mull it over to make sure you actually love me?
I already know I love you, Warren whispered, kissing Kuno's nose tenderly, and wrapping his hooves around her back, holding her close.
Now shut up and let's make a baby.
Kuno giggled again, purring and pressing close to him.
I love you too, Warden. Now give a procreation and hormonal rage.